Hey there. Welcome to The Climate Cycle, a podcast focused on Canada's climate tech ecosystem. In each episode, we sit down with founders building climate solutions right here in Canada to better understand the challenges presented by climate change and what we can do about it. In today's episode, we're sitting down with Justin Hunt, founder and CEO at Blaise Transit. Blaise's platform allows local transit agencies to implement on-demand transit and paratransit. So rather than relying solely on buses following fixed routes at predetermined stops, transit agencies can meet riders where they are. This allows them to optimize their operations, often providing greater cost efficiency, higher ridership, and better coverage for transit services. Expanding access to public transit is a powerful way to reduce the climate impact of transportation. Buses and trains can transport many people at the same time, which yields lower per-person emissions compared to individual car use. Public transit also contributes to more efficient land use and more walkable neighborhoods. But as Justin shares, expanding access to public transit is also about freedom, opportunity, and accessibility, creating more livable cities and enabling people to get where they need to go without having to own a car or spend hours in traffic. I've been following Justin and the Blaise team for some time now, and I'm very excited that we were able to sit down and chat about what they're building. Let's get into it. Justin, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Justin.
Awesome. So maybe we could start on your personal journey into climate and how you ended up at Blaise. I know that you have a degree in, I believe it's mechanical engineering, did a bunch of internships in different industries like aerospace. How did you end up here and kind of working on this problem?
Yeah, great question to start us off. So yeah, I did a degree in engineering at McGill, and actually even before my degree, I'd been involved with a lot of nonprofit organizations and working on different causes, whether it be food security or even environmental protection. But then I guess what I realized throughout that is that we do need people in the world who have skill sets that can actually bring real change and solve some of these critical problems that we're facing as a society. And so that's what kind of led me into engineering, actually. And mechanical, honestly, was just kind of a bit of a flip of the coin. I didn't really have any preference. Probably should have gone with software engineering degree, but mechanical is really interesting. But then throughout my degree, I ended up working on at a lot of different large companies, especially in the software consulting and digital transformation space, helping companies automate some of the more old school processes that they had in place. And what I learned there especially was, one, I hate working for a large company, and two, if I'm going to be dedicating a lot of time and effort to something, it needs to be something that I really care strongly about. And I hadn't really found that through different kind of consulting gigs, even working in multiple industries, whether it be insurance or retail. And so, and I noticed that the smaller and smaller the teams that I worked on got, or the smaller the companies, the more I was kind of motivated, the more freedom that I had, the more motivated I was to actually to go above and beyond. And so that's what kind of helped me realize that entrepreneurship was the path for me. And then, coming out of school, I wasn't really sure how to get into that. So I applied to this program called the Next 36, which is was one of the first original business incubators in Canada, started in 2010. And they focus on mostly new grads that, they pick the 36 most kind of promising, innovative people coming out of school. Some of them already have businesses and some of them, like me, do not. And they give them the resources over the course of 8 months to start a business. This goes, from funding and space. They give a crash course MBA throughout the summer in Toronto, mentorship, access to their alumni network, lots of different resources. And so this was a pretty big deal when I got into the program, but I did not have a business, did not have co-founders. All I knew was that I wanted to have an impact on the world and wanted to, start my own business. So, for me, public transit was really at the intersection of these three criteria that I had, which the first one was environmental impact. So we need to be solving a problem that was, reducing greenhouse gas emissions and having a positive impact on our planet. The second one was a positive social impact. I wanted to be making sure that it was something that was truly helping people in their daily lives. And the third one is that I didn't want it to be any sort of trivial technology. I wanted there to actually be a technological challenge that needed to be solved. So that intersection of those three things, and public transit really met that for me, and the inefficiencies that lay around public transit in terms of, getting more people to use the services and making them more efficient. But also I grew up in the pretty distant suburbs of Montreal, and my family and I relied on public transit on a daily basis to get to work, school, social activities, whatever it may be. And so being personally kind of affected in that way and spending more hours, on an empty bus than I can count, and waiting for buses that didn't show up for, and missing so many appointments. For me, it was, there was a huge personal aspect, as well to doing this and seeing firsthand the impact. And even to this day, at 30 years old, I unfortunately just had to purchase my first car because I moved out to the country, but I still, whenever I come into the city, I do take this regional transit bus just to, because I believe so strongly in using the services and wanting to, make them better.
Love that. Yeah, I feel like a lot of that resonates, growing up in a smallish community where there was bus service, but it wasn't really reliable. Sometimes it wasn't even clear, when it came or if it would come. I feel like is definitely an experience a lot of folks have had.
Yeah. And for me, what I kind of came to realize is public transit isn't really about getting from A to B. It's about access. If you do truly, rely on public transit because you don't have a car and there's no other method of getting around, well, then, public transit is about giving people access to economic opportunities, to education opportunities, to medical appointments, to visiting loved ones, friends, and family. So yeah, it's, it is a transportation and sustainability problem, but it's in my mind, it's really about giving people access to all these. It's like a means to an end in that way.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so could you speak a little bit to what Blaise Transit does now and kind of the specific problems it's tackling in the transit space?
Yeah. So two of the kind of major problems that we're trying to solve in the climate tech space is one, getting more people to use public transit by improving that experience and making it more adapted to the actual needs of the people, public transit is designed to serve. And then the second one is being able to make transit operations more efficient by adapting it to the true demand at any given time. And so how that works is this model called on-demand public transit, where instead of having a bus that follows the same route and same schedule day in and day out, the routes and schedules are constantly changing based on where people are requesting that they want to go. So it's a little bit like an overlap between Uber and public transit. And I really don't love that analogy, but it tends to make things click for people's minds. So I do tend to use that, even though I'm not necessarily the largest fan of Uber. Yeah. So with our app in cities that we work with, people can request rides saying they want to go from their house to their work at a given time. And then a bunch of other people will do the same thing. And our system will create the most optimal bus route to be able to serve all these people and get them to their destinations on time. So the bus drivers have to follow our navigation system that tells them where to go, where to stop, and who to pick up. And then riders get to follow their journey and follow where their bus is going. Meanwhile, the transit agencies can also obviously monitor their operations and see how things are going in a lot more kind of a real-time manner than they would have likely other had with their fixed route system.
Very cool. And so I know that there's a component here of AI involved in the process. Could you speak a little bit to what makes on demand possible now? Because as far as I know, this isn't something that's really been possible, at least at scale in the past.
Yeah. So in the past, I would say 15, 20 years, the ability to solve basically it's called the dial-a-ride vehicle routing problem. And it's very similar to the traveling salesman problem. And the ability to come up with those solutions faster and faster in real time is what has enabled, companies like us to exist. And so that's where a lot of the components of AI come into play, is actually how we solve this massive optimization problem. We're getting hundreds, potentially thousands of requests coming in from all over a city. We have to know where all the buses are in real time, what all their constraints are, what all the service limitations are, and basically come up with these bus routes on the fly. While also some people are requesting really last minute and some people are requesting super far in advance. So this adds another layer of complexity. It's not truly, on demand in some cases because, riders can request a week in advance, a day in advance, or 10 minutes in advance. And we have to figure out a way to kind of serve all of them with as few rejections as possible. So solving that problem and that optimization problem is mainly where we integrate components of artificial intelligence. But also one of the really cool projects I wanted to tell you about that we've been working on is actually going beyond just purely being reactive. So instead of just relying on requests that are coming in real time, we're also starting to plan around requests that we predict are going to come in. So if we can know a week out how many riders we expect to have based on the time of day, time of year, the weather, traffic patterns, gas prices, whatever it may be, we can actually figure out how many vehicles we need to have and where we should kind of pre-deploy them based on these predictions. And so that when the actual request comes in, well, the vehicles and operations are better set up to actually serve those riders than if we hadn't had those insights coming from machine learning. So that's kind of a couple of the ways that we use it. But yeah, definitely innovations in the past, 10, 15, 20 years have really made this possible. And it's still an active problem in the academic world. My co-founder is actually working on a PhD in this field because they're still trying to come up with better and better solutions to solve this vehicle routing problem.
Interesting. That's super cool. And so it almost sounds like a blend almost between on-demand and fixed route planning, where you're able to give some of those insights and kind of make the on-demand a little bit more predictable and optimize some of those assets so they're in the right place, but not fully fixed routes.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to describe it. And another kind of thing that I should point out to your listeners and to you maybe is that this is rarely a door-to-door service unless the person has some disabilities that prevent them from walking to a stop. It is still a stop-to-stop service. And these can be real stops, like existing transit stops that will make people walk to, or they could be virtual stops as well that are just shown within the app. It could be just a street corner or a light post, that sort of thing.
Okay, so you'd have, say, multiple multiple riders from an area show up on one street corner to kind of aggregate that.
Exactly. So that we're not going to everyone's houses like that. That is definitely, that is some of the earlier kind of technology providers in this space. That is kind of what they did, but we basically optimize the stops as well to try to aggregate and, make sure that we can do as few stops as possible, but also we're not going to make people walk more than 4 or 5 minutes, so there's a balance there to be had as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so you mentioned, maybe not the biggest fan of rideshare. What other modes do you integrate with? Like, I know you kind of have I would imagine your rail and your large buses, maybe smaller buses. Do you integrate with things like micromobility or anything like that?
Yeah, so because of our typical clients are usually these small isolated cities or rural counties and communities, they don't typically have a lot of these options. So we are working on integration this year with Transit app, actually, that's another cool Montreal-based company that they would then have Blaise as an option as part of that trip planning journey with every other kind of mode like micromobility and like rail and everything else like that. But we're not as focused on the kind of multimodal integrations right now, just because it's not a huge demand from some of the smaller cities and rural communities that we work with across North America. But that is definitely on a roadmap and coming, but it'll be more, we don't want to also reinvent the wheel. We do want to piggyback off of, existing amazing technologies like Transit app or Google Maps have built in these cases.
Yeah, gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. I'd love to maybe hear your thoughts on the role that public transit plays in addressing climate change. I think at first glance, there's an intuitive sense that, right, getting more people, extending the use of public transit is going to be good for the climate, probably good for cities and livability and all of that. But would love to hear kind of your thoughts on that and how you think about kind of quantifying that climate impact, if that's something that's kind of possible.
Yeah. It's an interesting problem that we still are kind of figuring out ourselves, and other companies are as well, because I think you always need a baseline to compare things to. When we see ridership spikes in cities that we work with, like after they implement on demand or they switch over some of their fixed routes to on demand, we see ridership go up. well, okay, how do we translate that into greenhouse gas emissions? We can assume that the person would have otherwise done this trip with a single, a passenger vehicle, but who knows? They could have been carpooling, they could have been previously biking to work, and now they're using public transit, which, might actually be worse from from a
Right.
greenhouse gas emission perspective. So it is challenging to quantify. We do have some kind of benchmark data sets based on surveys and things like that we do use. But I think, the overall question of how public transit plays into climate change, I mean, the transportation sector, and I believe is the first or second largest polluter from a greenhouse gas emission perspective. But then it also has all these kind of secondary impacts as well around land use and critical mass of populations and stuff in certain areas and where people can live and choose to live. That has an impact as well. Like when I see these 6-lane highways being built or 12-lane highways, 6 in each direction in Toronto, I don't think just adding always more and more lanes is always a solution. I think we need to really consider how this impacts the way that we're using our land, not only in the way that we're polluting the air. Because eventually, we will get to a point where everyone has, electric vehicles, assuming they can afford one. But that doesn't solve the land use problem. It doesn't solve the traffic problem. It doesn't solve the way the urban sprawl is really not kind of well adapted for a lot of sustainable initiatives like public transit.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I know there was I was reading a study recently around the adoption of e-bikes and some claims sort of around, it reduces emissions by this much, but it wasn't really clear, would those e-bike trips have been by car or would they have been by foot? And are you actually just inducing, more e-bike demand and getting people away from walking? But I do think there's it's similar to EVs where people can point at, your EV runs on, the grid, but the grid is powered by coal. But if you get all the EVs plugged into this grid and then you can decarbonize the grid, it has this huge network effect. And I would imagine there's a similar thing with transit where getting people onto a public transit system that then electrifies and, society as a whole can kind of electrify these systems rather than relying on individual consumers to buy EVs. There are kind of these kind of networked effects.
Absolutely. And I have kind of a bit of a controversial opinion around electric buses in Canada as well. And I'm all for the, decarbonization of our public transit systems. But, a lot of these systems can do so much just by looking at, re-optimizing their actual current services to get people using them and to create better routes and better schedules and better transit models that people are going to actually use before you make that massive investment over to electric vehicles. We see, billions of dollars being spent on electric vehicles, but in so many of these places, they're going to be running empty basically. And it's like you have these buses that cost $1 to 1.4, $1.5 million on the road that are fully electric, which is great. But if no one's using them and they're still in their cars because your transit schedules, services, lines, routes are really not adapted to the population, well, that, you haven't really actually moved the needle too much. So I always say kind of optimize first and then once you actually have that figured out, then, make your way towards investing into that infrastructure for the electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles.
That's super interesting. I would love to hear a bit about who your kind of typical customers are. I'd imagine it's transit agencies, municipalities, but it's an area I don't know much about.
So the need for solutions like ours is quite varied, but we made some kind of specific choices as to who we want to focus on. When I first came into the space in 2018, I was like you. I knew, absolutely nothing about the transit, municipality space, anything like that. I had, degree in mechanical engineering, not relevant whatsoever. So basically spent the first 6 months calling every single transit organization, professional, driver. I'd sit on the bus, sit right at the front and ask the drivers how things work, how their schedules are made, everything like that, just to try to understand every single detail possible. And kind of what we found was that a lot of the larger systems in Canada, the TTC in Toronto, OC Transpo, the STM in Montreal, they had the funding, the resources to be investing in a lot of this type of technology. But as a result, there's a lot of, they already do have a lot of software that's adapted to those really large cities. Then on the other hand, these small cities, where on-demand makes the most sense, like the ones that, maybe have 30 or 50,000 people, they're running 1 to 10 bus lines. They're the ones who in my opinion, need on-demand transit the most and needed solutions to help implement them, but couldn't really afford them. The solutions that were out there were way too complex, took way too long to implement, and had all these things that were really just designed for the larger cities that, they didn't really need. And so we made a very conscious choice as a company in saying we're going to target and focus on the kind of very small but urban cities or rural communities and counties. And so this is the value prop for them has typically been like they've been able to replace some of the underperforming fixed routes that they have with on-demand transit so that they can serve more people with less resources in a more user-friendly way, if you will.
Okay, and I'd love to kind of dive into this a little bit more and maybe hear a little bit about the process of selling to municipalities. I know that there's a lot of climate solutions that ultimately need to be deployed in cities and in municipalities of all sizes. But I also understand that a lot of them are financially constrained and somewhat risk averse. So I'd love to hear about, from your perspective, what's unique about working with this segment and what kind of challenges do they face in adopting technology like this?
Yeah. So I would say, typically it depends on the city, like definitely. And that was kind of another reason why it made sense for us to sell to the smaller ones, is because there's not as much kind of red tape and
Right.
they're surprisingly a lot more open to innovation, I suppose, in some ways, because the risk is lower for them. If the TTC
Right.
makes a mistake, it ends up on the national headlines. But if Leamington, Ontario, a launch doesn't go super well, it's not the end of the world. And so for us, what's unique about the cities or selling to cities is that we do typically have to follow these public procurement processes. So they put out a request for proposals that we bid on. And then anyone in the world can essentially bid on this, and they evaluate the criteria and everything like that. So it sometimes can be a bit slower, but honestly, coming from doing a lot of enterprise sales and in my consulting days, like selling to large companies, it's not selling to a very large business versus selling to a municipality is actually not that different in terms of timelines and there's more rules, but there's definitely just as many steps. Even private companies will put out requests for proposals from time to time for a solution. So I think the toughest part in the earlier days was the barrier to entry is super high because their threshold or tolerance for bugs or accessibility or things like that is extremely low. In all these startup books and accelerators, they say, just get your product out in the world, even if it's filled with bugs, and you should be embarrassed by your first launch and stuff like that. But in the transit space, on the municipalities, this is not possible. They will not accept one single bug. We had to have an app ready on Android, iOS, and web and there need to be an option for people to call in that didn't have access to internet and phones.
Right.
So it took us, about 3 years from 2018 to 2021 was our first launch. It took about 3 years to build all the kind of minimum technology that they need. And it needs to all be done at a very high quality for them to kind of accept that they will use this. So I think the barrier to entry is pretty high, but then once you get some experience with them, there's definitely a snowball effect because a lot of them will see what's happening in neighboring communities, and then they feel a lot less they feel like the risk has been diminished quite a bit. So they don't mind hopping on board and adopting much more quicker than those early adopters.
Gotcha. So you find there's kind of, once you've deployed in a city, it kind of proves it for other ones and it makes that process a bit easier for them to wrap their heads around?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think what was really tough is to find those first few clients, especially as a startup with no experience. It's really difficult it's difficult with any new company, but especially I would say in the B2G space, selling to government. They typically, when they do go out to public tender to buy solutions, at least 1/3 or 1/4 of their criteria is strictly based on experience. So if you don't have experience, you can't get experience, and it's tough to get around that. So one of our first clients was actually an Indigenous transit system on Manitoulin Island in Ontario. Unfortunately, the pilot was very short-lived because it launched right at the start of COVID, and then there was the whole island and community was on lockdown and the transit system, was shut down for a long time. But we found a small community that really connected well with us. We built a strong relationship. I went there twice, spoke to the community elders and understanding all their needs, and that's what kind of built that relationship over several months. And they eventually agreed to work with us, even if we didn't have an enormous amount of experience. And then once they had kind of agreed to sign up, then a lot of others kind of fell into place as well. And then once we had launched and had proven case studies, it just made the whole sales process a lot easier.
I'd love to hear a little bit about your takeaways working with Indigenous partners on projects like this. Any lessons learned or things that you found to be more effective in working with these partnerships?
I mean, we have like some in Eastern Canada that we work with, are not specific to Indigenous communities, but there's Indigenous communities in the regions that are served, and we have tribal communities in the US as well. And I would say that there definitely are some unique aspects, like at least with, in Canada, it's definitely important to get the community elders on board and to be listening to them, like they speak on behalf of the community. But I would say there's, one of the things that I didn't foresee initially was things like, for example, like female riders didn't feel comfortable getting into a vehicle alone with a man. And so this was kind of another constraint where there was some safety concerns, especially like if it was at night and there's no one else on board. There's a lot of concerns around that because of all the missing and murdered Indigenous women across Canada and North America. So there have been some additional like kind of technology constraints that we've had to enable to accommodate these very real, needs and desires from community members like that. So some interesting, but at the same time, kind of sad realizations about the realities that they face, but also super motivating. Like I remember we were working with one, I did a focus group that I was running a couple of years ago. And one of the ladies, I was asking her how she gets to work, and she works about an hour away and has to hitchhike her way to work every single day on the side of the highway. And in the middle of winter, when it gets dark at 4 p.m. and it's only light at 8 a.m. and she's out there on the side of the highway and it's dark. And I just can't imagine. And it's stories like that, like when the fact that we can bring a safer and more reliable transit system to communities and help people like that. I mean, that's what has kept me going all these years. Not to sound like too much of a cliche, but that's honestly the truth.
For sure. Yeah. And I guess that, that really speaks to that access point that you mentioned earlier. And I guess as well, just about the kind of, triple bottom line, like thinking about the social aspects of these solutions as well. Absolutely. There's a climate focus, but also it has these ripple effects into communities. I think particularly when you can go and engage with the communities and understand these needs, that's when you can have these additional benefits versus, kind of plowing ahead with, hey, we have a solution we're going to implement. It's a very different outcome. And you get, stories like that.
Yeah, exactly. And I would say too, it's super important to make sure that we're talking to everyone throughout these launch processes. And we always recommend this. I mean, clients don't always do this, but we recommend engaging with community members and getting the drivers involved in the whole process as well, because sometimes drivers, I mean, either, I don't know if this is surprising, but sometimes they don't like this change as well, even though it's going to, enable them to have more efficient routes or serve more people. They've been doing the same route and schedule for the past 20 or 30 years, and then saying, oh, now you have to follow a tablet and an app and rely on this. It's definitely a big change. So we always recommend to get as many stakeholders involved in that process and part of the discussion.
Yeah. Love that. You mentioned earlier you had some maybe hot takes on, electrifying transit, but are there anything that you find people tend to get wrong about this space, whether it's on demand or kind of transit in general?
Yeah, I have lots of opinions, but I think one of the misconceptions about on demand is the one that I tried to clarify earlier, is that it did actually start off as basically being kind of ran with taxis as a last mile service, which we do a bit of, and there's lots of examples of that where it just brings people from their house to a bus terminal or a bus stop or a train station. So that is one, but there's also the models of on-demand where, we're actually taking these full-size 40-foot fixed buses routes and instead letting them roam free within an operating zone instead of doing those fixed routes. So that's kind of one misconception that we typically people misunderstand about on demand. But then the other piece too is that we're also not anti-fixed routes or fixed lines. There's definitely a place when there's critical mass and there's enough of a need in certain areas. When the buses or fixed lines are being well used and well utilized, like there's no reason, like if it's not broken, don't don't try to fix something that's not broken. And so it's not really a silver bullet in that regard, but there's definitely lots of opportunities. And so I think it's important for like any city or community to really do a deep dive into what they actually need. And we do that with cities where we run simulations and feasibility studies and kind of produce some recommendations and say, this is how you can actually use your resources more efficiently, effectively. This is where you could potentially grow ridership. This is where you improve service reliability or frequency, things like that. And then the other kind of, I guess, misconceptions about transit, there's this quote, I don't know if I'll get this right, but it's from a mayor in South America, I believe Brazil, that you may have heard of it, but basically, transit's successful when you have rich people using it. And I think one of the bigger misconceptions, especially in the US, like people actively choose not to use transit because it's perceived as a service for poor people. And I think that, could not be further from the truth. And we want to make sure that's not the truth. We want people to be using public transit because it's the most convenient, the most, sustainable, the most enjoyable form of transportation that you can use. And it's not just out of necessity, but really out of, convenience and all these things. The reason why I still take public transit, into the city, for me, it's like an hour and a half commute now, because I moved from downtown out into the country recently. And, I have the option of either sitting in traffic for an hour or sitting on a bus, a comfy coach bus for an hour and a half and getting work done during that entire period. So, it's either 2 hours lost or 3 hours where I can get work done. And I think that's what we should really strive for is something that, anyone across any, social economic group can benefit from.
No, that resonates a lot. If you approach it with that mindset, it's way less stressful a lot of the time to just have that done for you.
Exactly. And I think, Uber's it's a whole other thing. Like I'm not anti Uber, I do still use it, but there, I think it's definitely should be used to complement public transit and not replace. And this was actually, there was this was pre-COVID, but back when I was starting the business, there was a study, an academic study done by some university that showed that it was like 6 or 7% of all ride sharing trips through Uber and Lyft would have otherwise been done with public transit. And so they were actually, it's been shown that they're actually taking away riders from, that were previously using public transit that are now using Uber and Lyft. And so if, my argument was always, if we want to be able to compete and stay ahead, it's never going to be a door-to-door direct service like Uber. That's not what public transit is meant to be. But if we can get a lot closer and offer at least a user experience that's on par with something like Uber or Lyft, well, then, we're on the right path.
Yeah, love that. Okay, I'd love to shift and talk a little bit more about kind of what's ahead for Blaise. Could you speak a little bit to what growth looks like right now? I know you recently signed an agreement in New Brunswick. Yeah, maybe just talk about like, what does growth look like right now and over the next little bit?
Yeah, so right now, including, that recent deal you spoke with, we're working with about 60 cities across North America, and only about half of those have been launched. So we have definitely a lot of work ahead in launching about 25, 30 more cities over the next few months. But for us, on the product side, one of the big things that I didn't mention when I came into this space and saw what was going on with the technology is that a lot of the competitors that were out there were building these custom white label apps for every single city that they worked with. So it was like, actually we used to compare ourselves to Shopify in that regard, where we wanted to be a one-stop shop that any city could implement their services in the way that they want with clicks, not code. So we've set out to basically make it super seamless to put this in place very quickly, inexpensively, but at the same time, you can adapt it to all of the unique aspects of your cities, whether that be your type of service, the operating zone, the stops that you use, your fare structures, your payment methods, the colors, logos, whatever it may be. I would say we're like 85, 90% there in terms of being self-serve. We've done launches without involving a single software engineer or developer, and that's where we want to get, and being able to do even more complex launches without involving any kind of technical folks on our team is what's on the roadmap. On the sales side, so we just expanded into the US and we closed our first 6 deals in the States, 4 different states in the past few months. And so we want to continue expansion to the US. But yeah, like you mentioned, we started signing these grouped procurement deals like across New Brunswick, where we're going to be implemented in 12 different cities and communities across the province. We have a similar deal in Nova Scotia with 23 different cities and communities. And so the 2 projects are quite similar, but they're all going to be live on Blaise, using it to run their transit systems within the next few months. And so we're definitely going after and looking at more and more opportunities like that are either region-wide, statewide, or province-wide, which definitely has its advantages in terms of selling. We don't have to go through each individual one. We can go, directly to the province or state and win these grouped deals, so that Blaise could be launched in many different neighboring cities. The other big advantage of that is we could actually be allowing people to travel through multiple transit systems all with one app. You don't need to be downloading 3-4 different apps on your phone to travel across, a few cities for work or for medical appointments. So those types of projects like we have in New Brunswick are super, super interesting for us, and we're looking to get involved with more of those. And lastly, I was going to say on the financial side, so we fundraised a couple smaller rounds, but my goal and every founder or CEO's goal should always be to build a financially sustainable company, and we're actually on our way there. We're looking to break even by next year. And so, if we do, hopefully, we will get to this stage, and then, we can either choose to fundraise our Series A round, or we can continue growing kind of at our own rhythm and fundraise when it's right for us and when the market's right as well. We were discussing earlier, I think, the climate tech investment space is really taking off. Yeah. And you're seeing more and more funds emerge. So, if we want to fundraise in 2025, we'll be able to. But if not, I want to make sure that we can continue just growing with our sales and revenues that we currently have, which gives us the freedom to do what we want without being kind of at the whim of external capital and investors.
Yeah, that's such a great position to be in. And heard something from a VC recently, just talking about, particularly in today's environment, being able to stay in the driver's seat on fundraising and when and how you take in capital is such an important factor. And it's great that you folks are in that position and have built a business where you can make some of those decisions. And
yeah, and it's definitely not easy as well. I feel like we're fortunate, but I do think we've been pretty intentional about it as well. Like these other companies who are building these one-off systems where each one is different, has its own app and requires its own maintenance, like that model does have some advantages. They get to charge a lot more money and things like that. Yeah. But at the same time, then they're stuck maintaining dozens of different apps. It takes way longer to implement. So we've been very intentional about making a system that's very, very elaborate in terms of offering what cities need, but also at the same time, super simple and easy to put in place and edit, so that we can reinvest those engineering funds into improving the product, into really hardcore R&D projects like that demand forecasting using AI. Those types of things wouldn't be possible if we were doing those custom built systems.
For sure. We're getting towards the end of our time, but the last thing I'd love to hear from is, what's your take on kind of the role that the wider Canadian tech ecosystem has had on the company? And maybe if you want to share, a highlight and maybe something that you think could be a lot better in the ecosystem.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've done so many different accelerators and incubators. When I was starting the business, we did, Next 36 was the first one. We also did Techstars. We did a few local, climate focused ones. We did some, AI focused ones. And I generally have nothing but good things to say about those. I would say like the biggest benefit that or useful thing that's came out of all those programs is access to mentors and to a network of experienced entrepreneurs and founders. Like some of them offered funding, which obviously is always helpful, but I think, getting in touch with the right people that can help bring your business to the next level, I think that's been the most useful thing from my perspective. We've also, we've been involved with a lot of angel networks. Our first investors were Amish Quebec, the Quebec Angels, the Capital Angel Network in Ottawa. We've raised also from Investissement Québec, which is kind of the Quebec government's VC kind of crown corporation. And so, I think that, how can I put this, that there's definitely a lot more resources out there today than there were 10 or 15 years ago. But I also do think we need to be, how can I put this? Be also thinking outside of our borders and building companies that have that international ambition and aren't looking to just build a business that's going to make it big in Quebec or in Canada, and that are really going outside of the borders. And we need, the investment community, these accelerators and incubators to keep pushing us in that direction to, build more Shopifys in Canada and keep the business in Canada as well. I have so many friends. This is a bit of a diversion, but so many friends from engineering school that our brightest minds in Canada are going to optimize ads for Amazon in Seattle, and so it's right. Like we've invested so much into our education systems here, and we have great talent that's coming out of Canadian schools, but it's not so easy to keep them in Canada, and so I think. We need to make sure that if we're going to be able to keep businesses and the talent in Canada, we need, a lot more aggressive investors that are willing to support and take those early stage risks with companies. I think, raising Series A and Series B, like more on the growth side is a lot more accessible in Canada compared to the really early stage and seed stage, especially in the climate tech space. A couple VCs that will do these types of deals, but a lot of the companies that climate tech companies that I know have had to go and raise their first rounds in the States, and then what's keeping them in Canada is the next question. So I think the more Canadian climate tech angels, VCs, accelerators that are there supporting Canadian companies, and the stronger we'll make our ecosystem altogether.
Yeah. I love that. And I think, you're saying about, extending beyond the borders, that's how we get to big exits that feed back into the ecosystem and help kind of create that flywheel.
Exactly. Like so many of our angel investors, ironically, are ex Shopify employees. Like I think we have 3 of them that were the first part of the first 100 Shopify employees, like not even super high up. And, because of Shopify's success, they're now reinvesting into other Canadian companies that align with their values. So I think we need a lot more of that in Canada.
Love that. Okay, I'll finish off with just a quick rapid fire. First thing that comes to your mind, what's a piece of advice you would give to someone who's looking to make the jump into climate but doesn't know where to start?
Start with a problem, a big problem that you care deeply about that's going to keep you motivated for the next 5 to 10 years.
Love that. And is there a book, newsletter, podcast that you would recommend to folks?
One that I love that I'm reading for the second time right now is Start With Why by Simon Sinek.
Oh, yeah.
It's not climate focused, but definitely on building a mission-driven company and how to basically get a group of people to rally behind something that's bigger than yourself, like climate. I mean, when I read this book, I read it through that lens. So that would be one that I would recommend to any founder.
Perfect. And then any ask for the folks that are listening, and where can people find you?
Yeah, I mean, if your ask would be, if you're looking to join our company, we're always hiring for different roles every couple of months. So, right now we're looking for a new product designer, and we'll soon be looking for new mobile developers and investors as well. I mean, we're always looking to get in touch and build those relationships. So any climate tech investor that, seems to like what we're working on, please reach out. Our website is blaisetransit.com, and you can put my email in the comments or in the description for people to reach out.
Sounds good. Awesome. Well, Justin, thanks so much for joining us. This was a fantastic conversation.
Great. Thank you so much as well, Justin. Have a great day.
Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed today's episode, leave a rating and a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It would mean a lot and helps grow the show. To stay in the loop on Canadian climate tech news, recent fundraising, job postings, events, and more, subscribe to the Climate Tech Canada newsletter on our website. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.